All right, grade 7, 8. Welcome back to another online social lesson. Today, we're going to mostly be doing a review of the stuff that we kind of talked about last lesson and what you guys did on your own. I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we move on to where Japan is going to meet some people that they've never met before, which is going to be cool. But today, review. So, we talked a lot about the shogun. Um, Last class or last time we had a video lesson, we talked about how he was a daimyo, a leader or a noble in Japan who they had all been fighting battles, and he was finally the one who defeated everybody else in battle. He was a wise, clever military leader, and the emperor named him shogun. So he was like the military leader of Edo Japan. So Japan before it was known as Tokyo, it was known as Edo, and um, even though the emperor was like in title the leader of Japan, the shogun kind of called the shots. He was the big leader, and he wanted to make sure that he did things to make sure nobody else could take it back from him. So he made this hierarchy. And if you remember a hierarchy, it means there's some people at the top who have all the power, and there's people below them, kind of divided into groups that have less power and less power and less power, more usually more responsibilities and more work required as you go down. And he made sure he was at the top of the hierarchy, and people that would oppose him were much farther down. And then he decided to make sure that there was restrictions and bans on people like the other daimyo, the other nobles, like making them come back to Edo and spend every other year there so we could keep an eye on them, making sure that they couldn't expand their territory and get more men so that nobody could come and take over him. He wanted to make sure that he was the leader and nobody was going to stop him. Um, we talked about this hierarchy, and you guys looked at the different groups that he divided people up into and what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. We're going to quickly review that today because it's quite important. The first group you looked at were the peasants. And the peasants were very, very important in Edo, Japan. Why? Because they produced all the food. They cooked they grew and produced and harvested the rice and all the other um, things that and luxuries and resources that Japan needed to survive. We talked about them being self-sufficient. Well, without the peasants, you weren't going to be self-sufficient, right? And this was very important to their worldview that they didn't need other countries. But how did the shogun keep the peasants down? How did he make sure that they couldn't rise up or realize that maybe they weren't being treated as fairly? Well, what he did was they were forbidden to smoke or drink, which makes sense if they're like the very, very important bottom line, making all your food for you. You don't want them to get sick or being dying at a young age. You wanted them to be healthy, and to some people, smoking like fine cigars and drinking the rice wine was like a luxury that only the nobles should have. The peasants shouldn't be allowed to do that, which was unfortunate for them at the time. And they also needed special permission to be able to leave their district. They were supposed to stay there and work and not really go anywhere else. They didn't go on vacations. They didn't go visit family or anything. They stayed and they worked, which was one of the ways the shogun kind of oppressed them and kept them down and made sure that they did what he wanted them to do. Um, and as we move down, I'm going to, on the right hand side here, as you can see, I'm going to kind of keep a list going of the hierarchy and where people slotted into the hierarchy. So peasants were actually, if you think about the emperor and then the shogun and then the warriors, who we'll talk about later, peasants were actually not as far down as you'd think. We'll talk about artisans. And if you remember correctly, artisans were like the skilled artists and the creators, your potters, your blacksmiths, and your actual artists and all that stuff. They made the paper and the pottery and the silk dresses. We talked about these in the Aztec and Spain society and how important they were to their economy and how they made money. Well, same in Japan. Obviously, they were an important group. But how did the shogun keep them down? Well, he wanted to make sure that they didn't get any ideas about like going out and having their own dreams and stuff. So if you were a son, you had to go into the same skill as your father. So if I was born and my dad, Mr. Brown, was a potter, then I would have to be a potter as well. If he was a blacksmith, I would have had to be a blacksmith. There's no going out on your own. You do what your dad did and forever on in that line. Um, but also, the artisans were valued lower than the peasants because they needed the peasants for their materials. Without the peasants, they couldn't make their stuff if the peasants weren't creating silk for dressmakers, if they weren't creating ore for the blacksmiths, and the artisans wouldn't have been able to do anything. So they were actually lower down on the hierarchy than the peasants. So moving on, the next group we had were the merchants. And once again, you can see on the side here that we've got our artisans below our peasants on our hierarchy. And the merchants, I'm sure you all know what the word merchant means. They were the traders and the sellers. So they would take the things the artisans build, they would take the resources that the peasants made, and they would trade and sell them. They were very important for Edo Japan as well because they shipped food and they stored the rice. Without them, none of these jobs would have happened. How did the shogun restrict them and make sure that they weren't able to rise up against him? Well, the merchants, since they saw a lot of people and spoke to a lot of people, the shogun made it very clear that he could take over their business and take all their supplies if he caught them bragging about their wealth. The merchants made lots of money for selling and could pocket money as well. Like they weren't supposed to, but they could, and that could get them in big trouble. Um, and if he heard them talking bad about the government or the shogun, if any news got out that, hey, this merchant was like saying, you kind of suck, shogun, then he'd be like, yeah, well, that sucks because I'm going to take over your business now and take all your supplies. So that was just part of the law. If that happened, then the shogun was able to come in. And also, the merchants were lowest on the hierarchy because they didn't produce anything. They were simply the middleman. Peasants produce this, yeah, I'll sell it for you. The artisans produce this, sure, I'll sell it for you. But they didn't actually produce anything themselves. So, as far as the Japanese were concerned, they were very low down on the hierarchy of the totem pole. And then finally, once again, you'll see here on the side, we've placed our merchants on the hierarchy. Uh, we'll look at women. And women were in some ways similar to the way we looked at when we like researched the Aztec and Spain and ancient Athens, even if you remember that from grade 6, in some ways different. So they had the same responsibilities as men. They worked in the field as well as the home. They could be rice farmers, they could be artisans. If women were part of the samurai line, which we're going to talk about next, they were expected to give their children a samurai upbringing and make sure that they kept that line going as well. But unfortunately, although they had the same responsibilities, as we've seen in many of our case studies on ancient civilizations, they did not have the same rights. In Edo Japan, women were not considered legal citizens, so therefore they could not own property and they could not enjoy many of the other rights that the men at the same time did. And as we do with many of our case studies, we talk about how it's important to look at these um, misdoings in the past and be thankful for how far we've come and make sure that uh, discrimination like this doesn't occur in today's society. And finally, we get to look at the really cool one, the one everybody's interested in, the samurai. And the samurai, I always think that these are very similar to the Aztec warriors, where they held the warriors in such high regard. This was no different, and maybe even more so in the Japanese, in the culture and society of Edo Japan. Samurai were the well-respected warrior class, very high up in the hierarchy. They lived with and served their masters, or the daimyo, the noblemen, and only samurai were allowed to draw swords and have swords. And they say that in the Edo period, samurai swords were a symbol of their social privilege. The samurai used them to reinforce the social order, so to make sure that nobody broke the rules that the shogun had put in place. And they had the right to behead any commoner who offended them. So, like, you did not, if you saw a samurai, you kind of like looked at the ground, you did not dishonor him or speak poorly of him because he was basically kind of allowed to do whatever he wanted almost. A samurai's sword was kind of like considered to be his soul. So, very cool, very interesting how much power and how much respect they had in ancient Edo Japan. But the shogun wasn't silly, and he made sure the samurai were also bound down and couldn't rise up against him. So there was a strict code of honor the samurai had to follow, um, and this was things like they couldn't own property, they couldn't own businesses. They had to live with their masters and pretty much serve them almost like kind of like warrior slaves, but with a lot more respect than slaves would receive. But once again, lots of things that made sure the samurai were staying in check. And there was a thing called the Ronin, the samurai without masters. So basically, any samurai who lost his master, and this could happen a couple ways. Either your master was killed, your master died of old age, or maybe you did something bad and fell out of favor with your master and he exiled you. Um, but all those things could cause you to become a Ronin. And being known as a Ronin or a samurai without a master was like the lowest you could possibly be in the ranks of the samurai. It was like very dishonorable. Nobody wanted to have the title of being a Ronin. But the Ronin, the idea of the Ronin leads us to one of the most important and fascinating stories of Japan's history, and a story that they still celebrate today. They still talk about. There's been movies made of it. It's just a really important aspect of their history that defines kind of their worldview and what their kind of their beliefs are today as well. And that's the story of the 47 Ronin. And I'm going to tell it to you right now. You don't need to know it. You don't need to, I'm not going to ask you on a test or anything, but I just think it's really cool and I'd like to share it with you. So basically, when the emperor found out and heard about what the shogun had done, because he had kind of brought peace to Japan, right? He'd stopped all the warring between the daimyo, all the noblemen, and this made the emperor happy. He's like, "Oh, right on, no war in Japan. This is awesome. I got to come and congratulate this shogun. I got to show him how happy I am." So he sent word and said, "Yeah, I'm coming. I'm bringing these noblemen with me. I'd like to come and let you know." Um, just show my appreciation. And the shogun was like really excited, and he said, "Okay, I have to get all my favorite noblemen with me to like kind of come and just show off a bit and show how powerful we are." So he kind of sent out messages to all his top lords and said, "Hey, this is when they're coming. I'd like you to be there." The problem was there was one lord, and his name was Lord Asano, and he was a very good military strategist and combatter, but sometimes he didn't always follow the customs that the Japanese needed. He wasn't always like the classiest guy and didn't follow the proper rules. Like if you were going to meet the queen or something, you have to use the proper cutlery and stuff like that. He wasn't big on that. And the shogun did not want that happening when the emperor was there. So what he did was he took his top like class trainer, or his most like well-respected member of his council, Kira Yoshinaka, and he's like, "Could you please go and help Lord Asano? I need you to teach him how to be like really proper, make sure he's not going to make any mistakes." So he sent him over to Lord Asano to teach him how to be proper in front of the emperor. And that's what he did. He went through all the instructions. He taught Lord Asano how to properly address the emperor, how to act around him, and it was really good. But when he was done, he demanded payment. And you can see him, he's down here on the ground here, and this is Lord Asano up here, and he demanded payment from Lord Asano. He said, "Hey, I just like did all this work for all these days teaching you how to be this classy guy. I need some money." And so Lord Asano gave him a bit, and then he kind of like badmouthed him. He was like, "Oh yeah, this guy's cheap. He didn't pay me enough money." Uh, s- and if we know anything about what culture was in Edo Japan, it was that you did not want to be dishonored. You did not want to look dishonorable. And when Lord Asano found out this guy was bad talking him, he was like very mad, and he's like, "How dare you!" And what he did was he attacked him with his sword and cut his arm. And Lord Asano knew that this was like a big time no no. You do not draw your sword and you do not attack a member of the shogun's um, royal council. And once he found this out, he was sentenced to death. And Lord Asano was killed for this crime. What happened to his 47 samurai that served him in his palace? Well, they became the 47 Ronin, the 47 samurai without a master. And the 47 Ronin were left wondering what to do about this. They wanted some way to be able to honor their daimyo, their leader, Lord Asano, who had treated them well, and they felt like he had been given an injustice by what had happened. They thought he was standing up for himself. So for 2 years, they planned revenge against nobleman who had dishonored Asano, causing him to lash out. And at the end of those 2 years, the 47 Ronin snuck into his palace, defeated his samurai, and killed the nobleman who had dishonored their lord, knowing that they had also broken the tradition of the samurai. All 47 of them were also sentenced to death and killed. Um, and if you go to Japan, or if you ever go to Tokyo, you have to go to the Sengakuji Temple, where the graves of the 47 Ronin can be found buried side by side. And it's a beautiful temple. I've never been there, but I want to go there very badly. When you walk in, there's a statue of the leader of the 47 Ronin, and he's holding a scroll with all their names on it. And you can go in, you can see there's incense and flowers set on the graves here, and you can go and kind of read about the story. And it's just a very cool part and a very interesting part of Japanese history. Uh, just really shows you what honor meant to them, and how it's still a huge part, as we're going to learn in the next class, of their culture and what defines them. But anyways, just a cool story, and you'll see here people thought it was cool enough. It's been a bunch of movies made after it. The one on the left, obviously quite a bit older, and then the one on the right, I'm not really sure how Keanu Reeves got to play a samurai when he's clearly not Japanese, but he did, and he was in the movie The 47 Ronin, which came out not too many years ago, I don't think. But yes, it spawned many movies and many stories about this grand history. Anyways, guys, today your homework isn't very long. There's a short little reading called Edo Values in Modern Japan. So, kind of talking about how the story we just learned about and the values that they had in Edo Japan, you can still kind of see them in modern Japan in the way that people live their lives in current 2020 Japan. And then there's an activity, the modern day samurai. It's just two questions. It won't take you very long, but it's just to think a little bit more about what we talked about today. Other than that, guys, have a fantastic weekend, and I will talk to you on Monday.